All right, welcome back. I hope everybody had, oh, not yet.
Wait, setting up.
Welcome back. I hope everybody had a nice coffee break and was able to get a little bit of caffeine of their choice or sweets of their choice. To the second session for today's conference day on metrics and assessment. The last talk today we have before the open discussion is with Stephen Curry. Stephen is a professor of structural biology at the Department of Life Sciences at Imperial College, where he's also the Imperial College's first assistant provost for equality, diversity, and inclusion, a very important position. And he is currently chair of the steering group of the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, better known as Dora, which is actively promoting reform of research assessment worldwide. And we're going to hear all about Dora and responsible research assessment in his talk, I'm sure. So take it away, Stephen. You have 30 minutes.
Right. Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in today's event. As Wolfgang said, it's nice to have the opportunity to talk about things that we don't often talk about. I'm only sorry that we're not actually in Chile at the Atacama Desert at one of the ESO facilities to discuss this, but we will deal with the situation as we find it. As Sean said in his introduction, I'm a professor of structural biology at Imperial College. We do have astrophysicists and astronomers at the college, but I'm not one of them. I am a keen but very poor amateur. I really have to put the emphasis on amateur. So from my back garden, this is a photograph I took a couple of years ago of a transit of Mercury. I don't think there were any massive scientific insights were gained from that, but it's something I take a great deal of pleasure in, and I'm introducing this only really to tell you, or to remind you that my perspective on this whole area is very much informed by my own background. I work in structural biology, but I work on the biology of RNA viruses, and so a lot of my research is in the biomedical area, where, as we've already heard, then a lot of these issues around assessment are, I think, particularly acute. And I think biomedical scientists are among the worst offenders when it comes to using metrics inappropriately in research assessment. So in my talk, I am, having listened to the session, the talks earlier, I'm going to weave around many of the issues that have already been touched upon, and particularly there's quite a lot of intersection with Noemi's fascinating presentation, but also on some of the issues raised by Ute and Jenny and Wolfgang and Martin. And I will stick to time so there'll be plenty of time for discussion at the end on the half hour. So my entry into this whole area was really around sort of thinking about the intersection actually between open access and research assessment, which I've been writing and thinking about for quite a lot for 10 years. But although it's true, I think, as Wolfgang said, that we don't often talk about these things. Actually, some people have been talking about them for a very long time. And so the mores of the scientific community and the ideas around what science is for and how science's relationship with society, with governments, with other stakeholders, and with the public has been changing and shifting, has been under discussion for really quite a long time. And this is a really interesting paper from 1999, which by a sociologist of science, Michael Gibbons, talking about science's social contract. And he recognized that in much of the post-war period, scientists were basically left to get on, and their job was to do good science and produce reliable results. And then it was down to government and industry to take and do with those results, whatever it was that they saw fit. And he, in the sort of traced in the latter part of the 20th century, then a much more dynamic and porous set of interactions and interfaces between science, between society at large, perhaps the public represented by governments, but then also industrial and commercial interests. And Gibbons, along with others, including Helga Novotny, for example, coined this idea of making the importance of scientific knowledge being socially robust. So the science not only had to be reliable, but there was, I think, recognized an increasing interest of the public in actually having research that was of value to them and of use to them. Now, clearly that doesn't apply to all disciplines. I mean, and I'm sure that astronomers and astrophysicists can put a very stout defense together as to the value and the import of what they do, even if they're not, for example, curing disease. But so there is a broader conversation there. But to produce socially robust knowledge, it is recognized that the production must be seen by society to be transparent, i.e. open, and participative. Okay, and these are some of the principles actually that were re-enunciated, as Martin referred to earlier, in the Hong Kong principles. But these ideas have been around and permeating the scientific community for a very long time. But we are here today because actually implementing those ideas in the most robust fashion remains a challenge. And again, as Martin and others have pointed out, we have seen the rise of metricisation, not just in market economies and in the general approach to industry and production, but to the analysis of all types of human activity, and science is no exception to that. And this is an article I wrote a few years ago, pointing out a particular instance where a health crisis had actually led to basically a revelation of the problems within our publishing ecosystem and in the way that we assess credit and the way that we do research assessment. So as you may remember, in the run-up to the Rio de Janeiro Olympics, there was a lot of noise in the press about the rise of Zika virus and the concern about a potential link between Zika virus infection and the appearance of microcephaly, so small brains and small heads on newborn infants. And in order to address that public health crisis, the Wellcome Trust led a coalition of funders and publishers to bash out an agreement to get the research community to release their information, their data and their results as soon as possible. So to put their data on the internet, to publish preprints, to get it out there and not wait for the normal process of peer review to kick in, so that the international community could come together, work the problem, see if there really was a link, and then try and plot a way forward. And of course, we've seen exactly the same thing during the COVID pandemic. But what this crisis shows you is that our normal processes of sort of curating the scientific record and of assigning credit have brought us into opposition to the public interest. And as the public do actually pay for most of scientific research, something about like 3/4, I think, certainly in the United Kingdom, then I think we have to be alert to those demands. And I think these questions that we're discussing actually do resonate within the scientific community, but actually also at large in well, certainly in Western societies where we have, market-led economies that have been very much influenced by neoliberal thinking. And Michael Sandel, who's a Harvard philosopher, has written and spoken very eloquently on this subject and draws attention to the problems created by the outsourcing of public policy and ideas about the public good to private contractors, but largely within government. This has perhaps been particularly strong in the UK and in the United States in the way that it's been implemented. But he tries to recall attention to the fact that, as societies, we do generally share a value in contributions to the common life and to collective well-being that go beyond how the market rewards you and how the market defines the value of your contribution. And we've seen the sort of negative impacts of that in things like the Brexit vote and the election of people like Donald Trump. But we also see the way that those kinds of ideas have come into the academy. And so we do have a marketization within the academy. We've got increasing weight placed on aggregate metrics that are of dubious value. They've become normalized, and often people shrug and say, well, yes, we know they're flawed, but what can you do? And I think we have to do a little bit better than shrugging our shoulders, because we know, and Noemi pointed out some of these from her study, that the reliance on metrics, while controversial, has negative effects, which nobody intended to happen, but they're here and we have to deal with them. So we know that the chase for impact factors slows publication. We know it creates a positive bias in the literature. We know that we now have a metric-driven culture which is hyper-competitive, and there are many negative aspects to that. It devalues important academic activities which are not research. And although, of course, the quality of research still remains a very important consideration. But we've seen the stresses and strains that puts on academics. We have, as several speakers already pointed out, there's very much a focus on the what and not the how or the who. So we have to think about the quality of the processes of research assessment and the quality of the culture that we invite people to inhabit when they join the scientific community. And we have to think about the diversity of that community, because historically it has been relatively homogenous. And there are, of course, issues of the way that fraud is incentivized, because the rewards that are attached to high impact factor publications are above and beyond, I think, the value that is actually resides within them. And there's some really interesting work, which I won't have time to go into, by Ruth Muller and Sarah Dora from 2017, looking actually at how culturally the inculcation of the reward mechanism that relies unduly on metric indicators is actually changing the way that research is produced. I don't know, you can tell me in the Q&A whether this is starting to infect astrophysics and astronomy, but one certainly sees it in the biomedical sciences. And they point out that, other norms and criteria of scientific quality, which, have emerged over centuries, such as, originality, long-term progress, societal relevance, they receive less attention as people become more and more obsessed with quantitative indicators. And so again, this is evidence of this unhealthy relationship. And this is now the way people talk about their science. And these are actual quotes from real people. I've just anonymized them, but our people know how to get the Nature papers. It's not our people know how to do brilliant science. Or a postdoc who told me, they were excited because they got a paper in Cell. They didn't tell me about what the discovery was that they were excited about. It was publishing in Cell that was really the be all and end all. And that shows this shift, which is subtle, but I think we do need to then think about reversing it. And that thinking has gone on for many, many years. This is a rather selective brief history of ideas around research assessment reform. Dora was one of the first out of the blocks back in May 2013, but we've seen already mention of the Leiden Manifesto, the metric tide, and the Hong Kong principles. But interestingly, this is, and these were kind of national initial. Well, actually, no, Dora's long been international. Leiden Manifesto was a group of American and European bibliometricians, but increasingly we see that this the drive to reform research assessment is gaining attention at a policy level on the European stage. So this is a very recent report from the European Commission, and actually on the worldwide stage. And so this is a very important document here that was published at the end of last year by UNESCO, which is talks about recommendations on open science, but ideas around open science are very intimately bound up with the need to rethink how we perform research assessment, because we have to create space for what it is that we value. And from Dora's perspective, then these are the research values that we would like to promote. So reliable, rapidly communicated, accessible, high quality research that transforms our understanding of the world and can change it for the better. Researchers who collaborate, who feel a duty of care to group members and colleagues, and a responsibility to the societies where they live, and a research system that values the people within it, cares about their quality of life, and seeks out the creative vigor of diversity. Now, those are nice words. We have to really start thinking about how we go about implementing them, okay? And this is an idea that other speakers have touched upon. I think we're all very good at diagnosing the problems, and we all recognize that these problems are difficult, but where I really want to focus, and where Dora is really focusing its efforts, is then thinking about, well, how do we actually get from where we are now to a much healthier and better place? And I do think there are pathways that we can map out, but we absolutely need to map those out alongside the research community, but also other major stakeholders in the whole ecosystem. I think, as I've said, there's an intimate link between research assessment reform and thinking about how open science, which was, has a long-standing status as an idea, that the idea that people share ideas. I mean, even in Humboldt's day, the idea that scientists formed a republic of letters was very much speaking to the idea that science has to be shared. This is very much seen also in Robert Merton, who is a sociologist of science and published a very influential paper in 1942 trying to identify, what the ethics and mores of science were. And this openness, this sharing, the idea that scientific knowledge is a public good was very much at the core of that. In the modern digital age, we see that actually happening in many different forms. I know that preprints are a well-established public feature of the publication system in the astrophysics community. It's a relatively recent innovation in many other disciplines, even though actually there was a brave and bold attempt to start a preprint service in molecular biology in the 1960s, which not many people know of. Which was effectively killed by the publishers of the day, who didn't really like preprints treading on their territory. But I think they're clearly on the rise. They've clearly played a big part in the managing the COVID dynamic and helping to speed the development of vaccines and new treatments. And it clearly nips in the bud the retardation of scientific communication and scientific progress that comes about by the chase for impact factors. So if people can still then submit their manuscript to a journal, but at least the information gets out there more rapidly. And I like the slightly subversive aspect of preprints because there isn't a journal name attached to it. And so people do actually have to assess it on its own merits. So there really is focus on the content, not the container. Wolfgang was talking about peer review. Preprints do encourage open peer review, although I'm speaking the bioRxiv, which is one of the main biomedical life sciences archives, does allow commenting. I'm not sure whether the physics archive does yet, but I hope that's something that they would consider. Now, these, I think preprints are an important aspect of, moving towards better science, but these things are not silver bullets. They do raise questions, and certainly in the realm of clinical science, there is some concern that publishing non-peer-reviewed results might lead to mistreatment of patients, but there are clear health warnings placed on them. And so I think, these questions can be dealt with. Overall, I think that the benefits massively outweigh the potential risks. But again, we have seen, and again in the COVID pandemic, the rapid misuse of information that is placed in the public domain. And we do have to think about those sorts of consequences. And I think, actually the rise of peer reviews is opening up questions about the value of peer review and the value of journals. There are some in the vanguard of the open science movement who say we should forget about journals, you should just publish in a preprint and then let the work speak for itself and let the community decide whether it's going to work or not. I don't share that view. I don't think broadly the academic community is quite ready for it. And I think, and certainly in discussing with other people, I think they do like their journals. I think maybe we sometimes overvalue peer review, particularly when we have discussions with the general public. But I do think it is a useful quality check. It's by no means foolproof. Many examples of peer review gone wrong. And of course, there are capacity issues that we will have to deal with. But at least I think preprints is opening up a more healthy discussion around, why is it that we really do value peer review and journals, and how might we do it better? Following on the heels of preprints, of course, is the rise of ideas around open access, sharing data and code and reagents. And again, of course, this adds value because it creates a global audience, maximizes a public good, so for reuse, and also the sharing and scrutiny that comes with freely available access can address questions of reliability that will sometimes even escape peer review. How, through shifting to open access, we assure equitable access for all authors, I think is a very live question. There's very much a north-south inequity here that has been raised by open access, is sometimes used by publishers, I think, as a critique of the open access movement, but then they also then forget how much the Northern Hemisphere dominates the subscription journals and is therefore often extracting finance from the global South in selling its wares. There's a certain degree of post-colonial inequity going on there, which we don't quite hear so much about. So let's have a much broader conversation about the challenges there. And generally, from the Zika case, from COVID, I think open access is much better for changing the world, but and open science practices. But if we are doing that for these health crises, why aren't we doing it for all the other challenges that we face together as humanity? The changing climate, the need to develop new energy sources, the despoilation of the environment. So at Dora, we are very much, part of that thrust, and there is a worldwide movement to rethink research assessment reform. Dora has a very prominent role in it because we, I guess, got in quite early. But there is a bigger picture here, and although Dora's focus primarily is on the reform of research assessment, we increasingly see that how it intersects with other important movements, either towards open scholarship, and also now, more recently, then the increasing attention being paid to the inequities within the academy. And these movements do intersect very well, and as I was struck actually listening to Noemi. It seems like people who think about research assessment, they do like a good Venn diagram. So mine is slightly different from Noemi's, but I think encapsulates many of the same sorts of ideas. And so Dora intersects with open scholarship, because open scholarship is about making sure that not only are the products of research available, but the methods and the data and the code. And Dora is very much about recognizing the diversity of outputs that come from research, not just thinking about the paper, not just thinking about how big was your last grant. In terms of open scholarship, it raises questions about how open is the academy itself? Who has a say in how science should be governed or run? Who gets in? Who has the power? And I think has usefully helped to draw attention to some of the power dynamics and power asymmetries that exist across the landscape. And research assessment, again, as we've heard from Wolfgang, is a process that can be very much subjected to influenced by bias, not just gender and geography and ethnicity, but that has, as we've seen, tended to lead to exclusion of large groups from the academy. So we do, hopefully, ultimately, these movements will coalesce, and we will build a research culture which is much more focused around people and values rather than on products and dollar signs. Now, that's a lovely red, blue, and green vision. Again, I want to emphasize, we really have to be hard-nosed about this. We have to be realistic. We have to understand I think everybody agrees that we could do a better job of research assessment. We could do a better job of peer review. We could do a better job of building open science practices. But as Naomi pointed out, nobody quite knows who's responsible. And that's because, this is a collective responsibility. So we really do have to come together as a community. But if we are going to tackle it, we do need to be systematic and take a systems approach. So we do need to think about the constraints on the system, the way that research is managed by governments and funders who are looking for a return on investment. I don't know of a single university in the world that doesn't feel some kind of financial pressure. I don't know, maybe some of the richer Ivy League universities in the United States, but I'm sure even they will manage to come up about complaints that they don't have enough money or time to do everything. I think this pervasive idea of the genius or the hero individual researcher is very, very problematic in many ways. We have a sort of stereotypical ideas of what a good researcher looks like, and then that can often lead to excusing, very poor behavior. So, we have to be realistic. I mean, I could speak for half an hour really about all the different constraints on this slide. But we cannot ignore these or say that, well, we just have to figure out a way to get around them. We do have to sort of roll up our sleeves and deal with those realities and actually go to where people are and help to sort of, lay out a path together to get us to a better place and a more healthy culture. So Dora is very much a part of this activity. It hails from 2013. It is best known for the main principle in the declaration: do not use journal-based metrics such as impact factors as a surrogate measure of the quality of individual research articles. However, what is less well known is that there are actually 17 positive recommendations for different stakeholders. So for institutions, for example, it's, be explicit about your criteria, focus on the content rather than the publication metrics, and think about the value and impact of all research outputs. And I think actually in many cases, universities, certainly when they're coming to hiring and promotion decisions, they're already moving in this direction. I think there is still perhaps undue weight placed on research activity to the exclusion of all else, but actually I do see, a healthy direction of travel. Now, Dora, as well as being a set of words on a piece of paper, is actually an organization, a campaigning organization. We have, this is the website. There's over 2,400 organizations have now signed up. That's been a big increase in the last 4 or 5 years. And that increase is due to the fact that we've been able to be much more active, because in 2017 we secured significant international funding, and we now employ 2 full-time members of staff and 1 intern who are all paid. And that has really allowed us to be much more active and much more proactive about tackling research assessment. And our job is not to go around saying to people, oh, you're awful for using impact factors, okay? You should do something else. We're very much about trying to, understand the problem and work with the community to develop solutions. We're very pleased that our steering group has got truly worldwide representation, because we really believe that this is a worldwide problem. We know that science is absolutely international. Our strategy is 3 main prongs: to promote the declaration, to extend our global and disciplinary impact, but the main one is really about developing and promoting best practice in research assessment. This is just a short set of examples. You can go to the website here, and actually these links are live. I will share my slides with the organizers, and they can distribute them to the audience, so you don't have to scribble down links. I should have said that at the beginning. But we produce briefing papers, we write articles, we host webinars, conferences, we run workshops within scientific conferences, mainly to try and ambush the scientific community that we think might not actually come to a conference on research assessment. As Noemi mentioned, we have a resource library and a curated set of case studies. We're a great believer in nothing succeeds like success. So if institutions and organizations have already been down the road, and we have a dozen or more examples of work that's been done to implement Dora at different institutions, that we think is going to help others to follow that path. And so, we're very active in developing these and in providing alternative mechanisms. We help to extend our reach and impact by collaborating with other organizations. And so one of the pieces of work we've been really focusing on in recent years is helping to develop the use and utility of the narrative CV as an alternative way of providing an informed sort of qualitative format of assessment that is also at the same time rigorous. And so we collaborated with the Royal Society in developing their resume for researchers, and that's now being widely adopted in the UK. We actually recently hosted a workshop to actually look at the problems of narrative CVs, because again, like preprints, it's not a silver bullet. It's not a golden solution that is problem-free. There are possibilities that we might introduce unintended effects, introduce new sources of bias, if it's not, and introduce extra steps of work. And the idea here is to try and make the efficient as robust, but also as workable as possible. And we've worked with people like Wellcome and also the Global Research Council to sort of develop policies and policy papers. One of our most recent pieces of work, thanks to a grant from Arcadia, which is a charitable fund of Elizabeth Rousing and Peter Baldwin, we now have a really good team. I mean, I don't know, I'm at the top of this only because it's alphabetically ordered, but the main people are Anna and Haley, and then Sarah de Rijk, Alex Rushforth, who's working in Leiden, and Ruth Schmidt, who's at Illinois, are helping to develop a dashboard which is going to help us then track the adoption of responsible research practices worldwide. This will help to surface more good practice and help to actually hopefully build confidence around the world that actually things are definitely moving in the right direction. And this will also then, this work will help us to build and augment the toolkits that we are already developing. Does Dora work? I mean, often we get reports from people say, well, my institution signed Dora, but they're not following the recommendations. And we do operate in this difficult space. We are expecting a certain approach from the people that sign the declaration. but we're not an accrediting agency, and we don't adjudicate on the quality of implementation. We are very much leading a community of best practice, and these are articles that discuss some of the intricacies and complexities of implementing that. I can actually add the links to these before I share the slides, so if you want to explore a little bit further. But we know that change is not always a welcome process. There are people who are reasonably happy with the status quo. I think, as Noemi's slide suggested, it's maybe people who are a bit longer in the tooth, people like myself, rather than early career researchers like Noemi. But change is hard. We all find change difficult. If the rules of the game are shifting, then that does make people anxious about the future. And we certainly have seen that within the academic community. There were reactions to Plan S, the European plan to make a rapid drive towards open access. It's too risky. It violates academic freedom. And then recently also then moves at Utrecht University in the Netherlands to reform hiring and promotion and to actually chuck out the use of impact factors in that process, raised concerns among academics that they thought it would lead to randomness and the compromising of scientific quality. And I don't agree with these views, but we do have to engage people who express these, because I think we do have a shared concern for the quality of scientific research and for scholarship. But I think, in tune with Atul Gawande, who I much admire, it's people talking to people is still how the world standards change. And so some of those conversations may be uncomfortable, may be difficult, but I think worldwide, there is a generally shared view about what it is that's valuable about research, and we need to find the best way to lead the reform together. So with that, I will stop, and I will look very much forward to the discussion session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, for that.
I'll stop sharing my slides.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, Stephen, for that really nice kind of tying it all together talk from all the discussions that came before. We have time for a discussion. We could take 1 or 2 questions specifically on Stephen's talk and Dora, and then we can open it up to the wider discussion. So feel free to ask your questions here on the Zoom chat. If you're watching on YouTube, you can ask a question there in the comment section. Raise your hand if you're in Zoom as well, then we can call on you to ask a question. Would anybody like to begin? Yes, Giacomo.
Yes, Stephen, thank you very much. I have a question related to many questions, but one related to the open peer review. And because I deeply trust in the importance of peer review and every review process. With of course the point that were raised by you and others, that the volume of publication that now it imposes, also Wolfgang mentioned that it poses that basically the burden on the shoulder of is so bigger and larger. So there is, but still, peer review is critical. So, but I was wondering, do you, having a open peer review, doesn't risk to go into what happened with the news on social media, basically, that there is a loss? So there is basically the risk that, in a sense, that we don't find anymore what is correct or what's not. I mean, the risk that there is the volume of information that is then shared is so large that you don't really, you see what I mean? You lose a bit direction. I've learned, but I didn't know, for example, when the COVID started, that the number of publications exploded, but then it was difficult to understand what was scientific or what was not. So you see, that the context I want to, so peer review is somehow critical in that sense. That's what I want to ask.
Yes, that's okay. So I think there were maybe several questions in there, but you're right. And certainly, I think people, they value peer review, and I think they value journals for providing that degree of certification of scientific knowledge. And so for the scientific community, if something's on a preprint server, and it's in your field, then you can make quite quickly a reasoned judgment as to whether or not you think it's interesting or worthwhile. or any good. When it comes to hot topic issues like COVID treatments, or the sequence of the virus, or things like that, and the information is shared in the public, then it can be much more difficult, I think, particularly for journalists and other mediators to deal with the volume of information. And of course, there was an enormous spike in activity in 2020, and that is an issue. I mean, responsible journalists obviously will get a second opinion, or they will ask an expert, okay, I've seen this preprint, it looks interesting to me, but what do you think? And so you would get a sense check of it. So open peer review, open peer review comes in different forms. Okay, so one of it is comments underneath a preprint that's published, and there, of course, it'll be difficult for anyone reading it unless they know who the reviewer is, to know how much weight to place on their assessment of it. And clearly, one of the values that peer review organized by journals offers is that they hopefully then can pick actually the appropriate experts, if they can get the experts to agree to it. Yeah. Some journals obviously are also experimenting in open peer review themselves, in that they publish the reviews. And actually, I do think that's good practice. The particular form that I favor is publishing the review, but not publishing the name of the reviewer. So there's a power dynamic here, depending on the relative seniorities of the paper authors and the reviewer. So if you have an early career researcher, reviewing the paper of somebody who's very prominent in the field, then if they know their name is going to be revealed, they might pull their punches and give a slightly softer review, because they don't want any comeback later on if that person is judging their grant application or even their own paper. So, but I think actually the openness, the transparency is it's a useful teaching exercise to help actually teach peer reviewers, new people, PhD students and postdocs coming in, okay, how do you write a good peer review? And also it is a resource for the public to get a sense that actually, not every research paper was a work of genius from start to finish, okay? And that actually the process of editing and actually to help promote this idea that I think many people understand is that science, someone talked about finding truth, and I philosophically I believe in the external the objective, the existence of an external reality, whatever, but even so, science is an intensely social exercise, and it's only if the community certifies a piece of work that it does gradually gain a wide acceptance, and that our idea of what is true today is very much based on, well, do most people agree with this interpretation of that experiment? And that initially comes through peer review, but then also with the uptake of a piece of work. And I think that helping to communicate the idea that that's actually how science progresses. It is about discussion. It's about whether or not people agree. It's not necessarily about saying here, this is now an objective fact, absolutely true. That would lead to a more sophisticated discourse.
Thanks.
So I'm not sure if I answered all your questions.
No, of course.
There's lots of
I agree. I
also
because just to clarify one point, that because to follow up, because one thing is, of course, if there is one paper coming out and is in my field, then it's true that I can read it. But instead of one is coming, there are 10 or 20 or 30 every day, then that's where I see that becomes more difficult. And maybe there are biases then, because I look only the ones of the names that I know better. Or so in that sense, that was the way I was thinking. The risk where it was. See, that's the direction. So
yeah, okay. But another way to accelerate the publication of the peer-reviewed literature is to reform research assessment so that people are not chasing after impact factors. I mean, my worst case was that I submitted a paper to 5 journals before I got one that accepted it. I've stopped doing that kind of thing now. I did talk to somebody a couple of years ago who's a fellow of the Royal Society who had done what she thought was among the most important work in her entire life, and she had been rejected by 10 journals. She spent 18 months not getting it published, and of course then that was 10 times that it had been peer reviewed, maybe sometimes by the same people, but of course those cycles of rejection and resubmit generate extra unnecessary work, in my view. And so we need a peer review system that can maybe make the peer reviews portable or whatever. And that would reduce the workload and perhaps then speed the publication system to address some of the issues that you raised.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more question for Stephen, and then we'll open it up for the rest of the panel. Wolfgang, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
I think I'm gonna it was more of a comment on, and I can do this in the panel selection. So the person that just raised their hand, I encourage them to go first.
Okay, you just lowered your hand again. Could you raise it? Yes, Tadeja, could you please unmute yourself and turn on your video so we can see you?
Yes. Hi. So thank you very much for this discussion. I couldn't follow the whole day, so I just heard the last two talks, but I'm a very junior person and I maybe have a bit of a naive understanding of how this whole metric system of evaluating the quality of a researcher came to be. But I'm also curious whether I understood that politicians, who are ultimately the people who decide on the fundings for the universities, play an important role and can understand numbers much easier than the quality of a scientific work. So in this, how would you recommend to bridge this gap? How would you recommend to communicate what quality science is without this kind of number statistics to politicians?
Okay, well, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure that I would put all politicians in the same boat. So I was one of the co-authors on the Metric Tide report, which was mentioned briefly in my talk. And that was a study that was done specifically on the request of the Minister for Science in the United Kingdom to see whether a research assessment exercise, which was broadly assessing, every university research department in the country, whether or not that could be done on a metric basis. And actually our conclusion was that no, it can't. Okay, I mean, it might work in a few of the natural sciences because you've got lots of citation data, but citation practices and publication practices differ enormously. And we're talking here about, physics departments and drama departments, for example, just to give an a range of the span. And I think, it was certainly possible to present the argument. Actually, peer review is the way that people go, because that is a process that people trust. I mean, they recognize there are many flaws with it, but it's the focus on the content and the quality that really is important. And so you're right in that, I think the numbers do matter to some degree, and at a certain level of scale, then quantitative information is, informative in terms of, just volume of output. Whether or not one can measure quality at scale is another matter, but you can to a degree. Okay, so the journal impact factor, we don't think that's a good measure for thinking about an individual researcher or an individual paper, but it does give a rough idea of the sort of a rough number of citations on average that papers in a given journal will attract. One has to understand that underneath that average, there's actually very wide distribution of 2 or 3 orders of magnitude normally. But even so, the law of averages applies. So, a paper in Nature is generally going to be more interesting, more impactful than a paper in the British Journal of this or that, okay? But that won't be true of every single paper in Nature or every single paper in the British Journal of this or that. And that's when it comes down to making decisions about people and pieces of work. Dora and many other people are saying, you really got to look at the individual. You can't fall back on the law of averages because it's a silly thing to do. And I think, those arguments are entirely reasonable. And I think my own personal interaction with politicians is that they're often very smart. I know some of them are not, and some of them I would, I won't mention names, but some of them I don't have an awful lot of regard for. But many of the ones actually that are responsible for science and and thinking about knowledge economies, they do want to think very seriously about it, and they are good at asking questions, and we basically have to be able to step up and have good answers for those questions.
Excellent. Thank you. I would invite the rest of the panel to turn on your videos and join us up on the main stage screen. And would anybody like to, before we get into some of the questions that are coming up on the chat, would anybody like to jump onto that as well to discuss metrics, this metrics question in politicians? Wolfgang.
I mean, I think just a brief comment on the politicians. I mean, ultimately, unlike us, where we sort of like self-assess, politicians are bound to the population in democracy. So I mean, they are in theory like representative of like the views of the population, and I can understand that as a population who says like I don't know much about science, and so I want to know like what's best, like I want a number. Like I mean, similar on Amazon or something like this, you look at the stars. So it's I think a very human endeavor to want a number. And so I think instead of like sort of blaming politicians, we should try to educate the populace that this is something that is not always as easy. A second point to what Giacomo says, like, unfortunately, I'm going to poo-poo our trade, which I think like academia is like someone said like a decade, I would say decades behind in innovation, which is ridiculous because in theory we should be at the forefront. And so one of the things that like the internet communities have found out is there's a lot of stuff being produced. For example, forums, online forums, like lots of comments are being put and lots of discussions are being put. And so they have realized like 10, 15 years ago, like there were moderators, I think in the late 90s and the early 2000s, often there were forums and they were moderated by people. And so like at some stage, this just went out of hand because you cannot read all the posts and sort of moderate and say, this works and this doesn't work. And so what like companies or websites like Reddit have done, they switched to an open peer review where people can review or can comment on statements. And like people can also upvote or downvote like these comments. And I am continuously impressed. So Reddit and Stack Overflow do this. I'm continuously impressed, for example, by the Reddit politics, which has very nuanced discussions in a very divided world on politics. And I think one of the reasons is because they have the system of like, if someone makes an extreme statement of like, all Republicans are stupid, all Democrats are stupid, like this gets downvoted or not upvoted. So I think like for this open peer review, one way to do this is think about like, existing systems from internet communities like Stack Overflow and like Reddit to sort of implement this. And then people can say like, this was an insightful comment about this work, or this was just a competitor ranting that like, this research is bad. So I think that's something we could think about and maybe implement, and that would potentially help the issues that Giacomo was mentioning.
An interesting idea, looking to other sectors and examples outside of research. Martin.
Yeah, metrics are actually far more popular in developing countries because politicians there really like to have numbers that make it easy to demonstrate progress, regardless of whether they're meaningful or not. And it is really a tough job to convince them that this is not a good strategy. In fact, that these hunt for these metrics actually stand in the way of making progress because they're entering a competition that they won't win. And it just stands in the way of them to materialize on their specific advantages, find their specific niche, think about where they have the strategic advantage. So for example, Pakistan has recently stressed how much the research output has increased, the number of papers. But maybe it's not such a good idea to think that you create more values by publishing more. Also, when we think about the whole review process, I think we should seriously, and about quality, we should seriously think about whether we should rather publish less.
Thank you. Ute, Jenny, you were talking about metrics and kind of responsible use of them in your talk. Do you want to comment on this discussion so far?
I mean, listening to just the past discussion and actually going back, if you look in the chat, there was a question about from Alessandro, to all of us saying if you were on a selection panel, which I'll stress, I'm generally not involved in selection. I'm providing a piece that goes into selection. But the question was essentially what we've been talking about. How would you select one winner? Who's the top person? And a little bit of what Martine was just saying. I mean, metrics they exist, and that's fine. If there's a lot of problems behind them, they need to be one small piece in the whole puzzle. So I think just getting some agreement that these numbers are a piece, but not the focus of a decision, and then you know, the big question that I think Stephen's talk was touching on is like, well, where did these metrics come from and what do they mean? You know, so when you look at journal impact factor, that's something we don't use it at all at Space Telescope. It is not something that goes into decisions for selection and hiring. I hope we don't use it for many, many reasons that Stephen would be able to articulate much more eloquently than me. You know, I think it's just a question of, the reality is what all of us have said, it's just so much hard work to do a complete assessment. So getting to Alessandra's question, it's really questions that I'd have about, has this person raised up a younger generation of researchers if they're going for a tenured position? And that's where going back to Dora recommendations, a narrative CV would really help. As Stephen said, I think there could be problems with narrative CV. I mean, it seems like everything that becomes a recommendation eventually gets gamed. People figure out how to use that and leverage that in a way that they was not the original intention. So I'm not saying that that's, again, as you said, the silver bullet. But again, I think just recognizing metrics exist. We need to understand where they come from. We need to understand when it's appropriate to use them, when it's appropriate not to use them. And they just can't carry so much weight. That's what concerns me as somebody asked to produce or give these metrics, is stop attaching so much weight and relevance to them. They are not the focus. It's about the researcher. It's about the research itself.
Yeah, if I may, I would add to what Jenny just said. I totally subscribe to what she was elaborating on. From my experience on recruitment boards, in response to what Alessandro asked here, I would say, first, of course, it's very important to clarify your own mind. What are you looking for? What does it mean, a good researcher or a good new staff member? Break it down to 10. These are probably the characteristics that you put in the job ad. Then break it down to 3. These are the ones you want to focus on probably in the interview. And then finally, that would be in a certain way, maybe the metric also, you come up with a scale, how well do my applicants respond to what I'm actually looking for. But in the end, I think it's really the qualitative measure, which is very much more difficult to grasp. And that's like the personality, the attitude. How does this person come across? And this is, of course, something that escapes numbers.
Excellent. Thank you. Martin, do you want to come in here?
I think institutions should be far more specific when it comes to advertising positions and what exactly it is that they're looking for. And frequently the interesting information that we would look for does not come with the application because we're not asking for it. And for example, I would be quite willing to write to applicants, we are not interested in your bibliometrics. And I personally have stopped looking at publication lists. This is not how I'm making my decisions. Now, clearly the case is different if you have 5 applications to review and 100 applications to review. For 5 applications, I think we recently ran a process within our department, which I liked a lot, where basically the applicants were asked to give a 15-minute presentation on their research and a 15-minute presentation of a lecture they would give. And it was extremely instructive. I think we could make a good decision on those candidates, but you can't do this with 100. So if you have about 100 candidates, I mean, things that I would suggest to ask candidates to do is first tell me about what are the differences that you have made. Another thing that I have been thinking about is, give applicants a certain task. Let them write a 1-page document reflecting on a recent topic in their field of research. And that's much better than looking at papers or anything like that. But then it also comes really down to what it is that for the specific person we're actually looking for. What is the post? What is the environment at the university? You can have someone who is doing great science, but this candidate is unsuitable for that specific institution. So there also has to be a match.
Excellent. Naomi, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, well, I think what Martin just said is really aligned with what I was going to say. So well, one point that I want to raise, and that is kind of well, I mean, we know about this point already by what we've been saying, is one thing that I would do personally is limit what we look at. So we have a limited selection of whatever we're looking at, so we can look at the depth of it. So that's the first point. But another point that I wanted to raise is, I think a couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference from Recognition and Reward Festival in the Netherlands, so with their all new program, and there were a lot of businesses presenting how they assess employees. And it was extremely interesting to see that they don't assess employees on performance, but they assess employee on behaviors, and behaviors like autonomy, accountability, collaboration. And then they described that this is the behaviors that allow them to select people that will fit in the team or in the environment where they put them. And we sort of forget that, I think, in science. We tend to focus on the whole profile and how much we've produced, the performance of an individual, and we forget the rest.
Thank you, Naomi. Stephen.
Thank you. Just very briefly, because I'm sure you want to move on to another question, but I really like that suggestion about assessing non-behaviors. I think we could go a long way with that. But I think also it is important to be clear about what is it that you're looking for. I mean, I spent last Saturday reading 33 CVs out of, actually it was a pool of 54 altogether. So these CVs ranged in length from 8 pages to 140 pages. Okay, and so I realized pretty quickly that actually we had been very stupid about the way that we'd gone about assessing it. And really what we should have done was ask the candidates, very specific questions about research, about teaching, about other aspects of their, the way that they mentor students. So I think really is got to be focused, notwithstanding, I think ongoing discussions about possible wrinkles with narrative CVs, and that's one of the way. But you've got to, if you have concise, focused answers, then that helps to manage the volume, so you can deal with 100. You rope in 3 or 4 people to help you with the task, and actually you need a diverse panel so that you've got different perspectives to make a good decision. And I think you also have to recognize that to admit to yourself that you may get it wrong. Okay, there isn't an answer out there that is the right answer, the winner. You can determine a winner of a football league after a season, and we can all agree on the metrics that are used there. But let's just admit that it's an imperfect process. It's very much reliant on subjectivity. And finally, just to touch on a point that was raised by Jenny about the origin of metrics and whatnot, and talking about not placing undue weight on them. I think one of the things we do need to be aware of is that the purveyors of metrics, so those who sell citation data like Clarivate and Elsevier, and also the purveyors of university league tables, this is good business for them, and they sell very hard to universities. And so the people in the C-suites, they are getting this hard sell. And I think we need to be perhaps aware of making sure that we're working within our own institutions to challenge that particular view, because these people can be very persuasive. They've got the resources to do so.
Thank you, Stephen. There's a good discussion going on in the chat that I want to bring into the plenary, but Wolfgang, if you want to add real quickly on this.
I really wanna echo what Noemi says, and what I sort of touched on before is we are very, very focused on our own little ivory tower, and I think industry has made gigantic leaps in assessment that we just completely ignored. So one of the things to the question before, how would you evaluate where you need to rank, you need to have the 1 person out of 100 or the 1 person out of 5. And so one interesting article that I read is Google did this and then used performance metrics to sort of say how successful they were afterwards. And so one of the really astounding things is all these evaluation using the best evaluation techniques only nets you a 40% chance of really predicting future success. And that includes also team success. I think this is one of the problems that we are facing in astronomy, that we don't think about teams, that we don't hire teams, but we hire for individuals. And so only in 40% of the cases was this assessment right. And so I think there is an element of I don't want to call it randomness and variability, and that we just will have to live with. People that have a lot of money like Google have looked into this and have tried things out. And it seems to be only that even after you do the best of the best, you get sort of 40% predicting how well a candidate, or like how well your best chosen candidate will do in the future. And I also want to quickly touch on a point that that Uta was making before, that Uta and Jenny were making before, is and I really want to emphasize that this is something we can do. This is something easy we can do, is this first author idea of like the assessing. Don't assess teams, but like, assessing only on heroship or hero worship, or like, first authorship. There's a wonderful tool called contributor role taxonomy, and I just put it in the chat, which allows you to sort of like specify what individuals have done. And so maybe then, like, as Stephen was mentioning, like, sometimes the assessment is not only like, how good are you, whatever good means, but how well do you fit in there. And so this might be a way to sort of like, get people to be experts in visualization, or experts in like, supervision or something like this. So I think that's an additional tool that we could think about using, actually, rather than just saying, oh, there's so many problems.
Excellent, thank you. There's a question and discussion about randomization that's going on in the chat. So Tanya Urrutia, do you want to jump in and ask your question to the plenary?
Hello, yeah. Yeah, it was about a randomization of like middle ranked. So we probably can, as reviewers, get rid of the worst or the best. Probably, I don't know. But in the middle, it's very hard to rank in categories, and we probably only can rank maybe 3 categories, if at all. So I don't feel quite right about this, but I don't know why. And maybe we can discuss this. How about just randomizing middle ranked proposals, for example, for telescope time or computing time or something like that. If it's luck, what you're going to observe, then it can be luck, who gets to observe.
A very good question. Wolfgang, do you want to tackle it first?
Yes, I mean, I think this is an excellent question, and I'm part of a working group with a couple of people, including Nanda Patat and Lou Stroger from Space Telescope Science Institute, that sort of like, is rethinking how we could do like, allocation of resources through peer review. And so I've read a number of things, and some people sort of say like, a lottery is good. So first of all, I think like, one of the things that I want to take a step back on is like, this idea that things are random. Like it's not in the sense that people roll dice. There's literature on this, and as far as people can tell, it is that people assess proposals using different criteria. It is not that they like, assign a number to this, but they use different criteria. And so if you have like, multiple people that use multiple different criteria, it does appear as random. It does not necessarily mean like, that each individual review is random. The other thing that I think like, I was sort of mentioning is like, if we go full in, we say like, whatever, we're just going to give lottery to go to the extreme. We're just going to do a lottery. Like you put a proposal in. I think like, we can argue if like, what impact this will have on our research metric, but what impact this will probably definitely have is like, on the public that we serve. So if we tell the public, like we're just gonna randomize it, it's just whatever money you throw it as, like we're just gonna randomize it. So I think it is not only like, what is selected, but also how is our research perceived, or how is our system perceived by the public. And if the public doesn't have any trust in us anymore, because out of multiple reasons, even though random might be a fair process, that's a problem. And I think that's something that we really need to carefully think about. It's the how we are perceived and how our autonomy is perceived by the public is something that we should constantly be wary of.
Excellent points, thank you. Martin, do you want to quickly jump in here as well?
Yeah, I see where Wolfgang is coming from, but I can't agree with his conclusion, because I think we have to accept that any ranking that we try to construct is not perfect. So we try to evaluate something, but our evaluation comes with a large uncertainty. And if you play with numerical evaluations, you have three candidates ranked 5.42, 5.45, and 5.48, but effectively your uncertainty is 0.2, it doesn't make any sense to put them into any ranked order. The problem that typically arises from these assessment and panel evaluations is there's a bit of bias. And that bias also shifts within that noise that you create within the uncertainty of the evaluation. So that if you make these rankings out of these evaluation, it easily happens that your selection at the end becomes dominated by the bias and not by any meaningful evaluation. In that case, a randomization is definitely better. I know that the Volkswagen Foundation introduced it. They're reporting that they had a quite positive experience with it. And so I also think that, having these broader categories of evaluation and then taking one category where you think this should definitely go ahead, one category this should not go ahead, and one in the middle, and randomize the middle. I also don't think that we will lose on credibility if people understand how that evaluation process actually works and how the evaluation process actually cannot work and how we're about to fool ourselves in thinking that we're actually assessing on merit in this middle area.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for pointing out the Volkswagen Foundation. The Research on Research Institute is also doing a lot of work into this. And as a funder, I know this is a very interesting topic. The Swiss National Fund is also working on it. So randomization is something to keep an eye on, also as a funder. Oh, and FWF. Thank you, Stephen. Okay, moving to the next question. Laura Watkins has her hand raised since a while. Thanks for your patience. Do you want to jump in and ask your question?
Sure. So we've been talking a lot about the metrics, but maybe a little bit less about the actual process of then the evaluation, just its outcomes. And one thing that we've been spending a lot of time at Space Telescope thinking about is putting together rubrics to make sure that we are looking at proposals or at like job application candidates holistically and in a structured and biased way. Like I was really struck by the plot that Wolfgang showed of, maybe the top one or two proposals and the bottom one or two proposals seem to be fairly, there seemed to be fairly good consensus, but everything else was quite random. And I think that speaks a lot to maybe the bias in the people who were reviewing the proposals and what aspect they thought was most important and they gave most value to. And so the way that we've been approaching that particular aspect at Space Telescope is instead of just asking, please give us a grade for this proposal, 1 is high, 5 is low, we actually split up into 3 separate sections and say, please evaluate this criteria and this criteria and this criteria. We explain what each of the criteria is. And then we don't just say 1 is high, 5 is low, give us a grade. We actually say, this is what we expect of a proposal that you want to give a grade of 1. This is the kind of thing you should be looking for if you want to give a grade of 2. This is what you should be looking for a grade of 3 in each of the criteria. We also do this now in our hiring, in our fellowship hiring, in our faculty hiring. The NASA Hubble Fellowship Program has also adopted this process for its review. I don't think it's a silver bullet. I don't think it solves all the problems. Of course, in codifying your rubrics, you can also introduce biases if your rubric is biased. But I think it does go some way to reducing a lot of the randomization and goes back also to Uta's point of making sure that you accurately clarify what it is that is important in your search, what you want to value in your search, and then making sure that all of your reviewers are looking for that in your search.
Multifaceted question, some good ideas. Who wants to tackle that? Wolfgang, you put.
I don't know if it was a question. I think it was a very good idea. I mean, and I think it speaks to some of the comments that were made earlier about having a structured approach to thinking about your criteria and defining them openly, and then judging on that. I just wonder whether, Laura, you've also thought about using anonymization as part of the process, because as been mentioned, the sort of gender and geographical location and whatnot, and your institution can be a factor there. And I think, wasn't it the Space Hubble telescope allocation, when it was anonymized, it turned out to be much
They were the
fairer
people
in
that did this first. Laura and team, and I mean, the whole space. They were the people that introduced this first.
Oh well, Laura, it's an honor to meet you then, and what a brilliant thing that you did. So my question is therefore redundant because Laura thought of it way before I even asked it.
Wolfgang, you added a question in the chat. Do you want to throw it up?
I found it really interesting to think about this inter-review reliability that essentially Martin was commenting on, this random effect, and I'm looking up the paper that was interesting on this to sort of see why do different people judge proposals so differently. I think this is something we should. I mean, that's why I think we need to do more of this meta research. We should think about this much more. I mean, these are not stupid people, and they're not we can see they're not all biased people, but it is interesting that smart and people that have a lot of time to think about things judge things so differently. And so I was wondering if you have a rubric where you say, these are the precise things that if you make a rubric where you say count the number of A's and the best proposal is the best proposal is the one that has the highest number of A, then every reviewer will agree because they will always count the right numbers of A. And I'm wondering what kind of rubric would we need to make that the inter-reviewer reliability is going up. And I'm wondering if now with your rubric approach to telescope proposals, I'm wondering if your inter-reviewer reliability went up. Or if you have the data for that and can share it.
I don't think we have the data for that, but it's certainly something to look into in more detail. This is certainly an evolving, it's not a silver bullet, it's not perfect. It needs to be revised over time to check that it's actually doing what we hope it will do. And if I may very quickly, just to address Stephen's point about the anonymity, yes, so for Hubble and Web reviews, we do have dual anonymous peer review. So the reviewers do not know whose proposals they are reviewing. We do not do that yet for our hiring. I think this was talked a lot about yesterday. And one of my concerns is that if you remove a lot of the identifying information, that you actually might introduce biases into the system, because if you say evaluating two candidates who are, in the final year of a 5-year PhD, but you don't consider their institutions, you're missing about what kind of resources have they had access to, what kind of networking opportunities have they had, because their advisors, very senior and in a lot of collaborations. And so you don't want to give someone a high score just because they're at a prestigious institution, but if you don't take that into account, then and take all their resources and the opportunities they've had access to into account, then you're going to say, well, they've done all these really great things, they're really great, and you're still going to give them a high score because they were at a prestigious institution, even if you didn't know that's why you're giving them the high score. And so I think there's a lot of good things about anonymous review, but I think, again, it's not a silver bullet, and there are some cons to that as well that we need to think about more fully before we sort of dive in and do that without thinking it through fully.
No, I completely accept that. And I think when it comes to hiring people, it is more difficult to manage. Maybe at the first triage stage, it can be more anonymous. But then obviously once it gets to interview, hard for that to be anonymous unless it's like a orchestra audition and it's absolutely behind the screen. But I don't think that's really going to work for science.
Martin, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was wondering whether it would be possible to collect a bit of information from the reviewers on why they arrived at the decision, because I think this is a point that is really worth studying, and we should aim at better understanding this, because it is important that we come up with a reasonable review process, because that is essential to so many things, as Wolfgang never stops pointing out. So at least for a good research project, is there any opportunity that we could collect this kind of information?
Okay, we have a question from YouTube as well. This is directed more towards Wolfgang and his comment about the Reddit up-down vote. The first thing that came to mind would be a concerted biased action to downvote papers or comments that people don't like. And specifically, they wonder how affected small groups would be. Do you want to comment on this?
I mean, definitely. I mean, this is, I mean, as all human endeavors, which is why I love science. It's such a, I mean, it's not a black and white thing. So, I mean, this reminds me of steam and review bombing. Like, if a company doesn't necessarily do what people like to do, then people go and do a concerted action to sort of like review bomb one of their products, which sometimes is a fair assessment. I don't know. I haven't studied in detail on how this works. So the only evidence or the only anecdotal evidence that I can sort of give is that we introduced this in the distributed peer review, where we sort of at the end asked the proposer, after having been shown the grade, after having been shown like if you got the proposal or not, how much they rated the helpfulness of the reviewer comments. And I was surprised, and this is in the 2020 paper, so people can just, I can put it in the chat. I was surprised to know that, like, even if people were rated really low, they were pretty nice about sometimes saying like, no, actually, there was a fair criticism. So I don't know how bad people are, and I guess these things will happen. But I mean, we can look at Reddit and we can look at Stack Overflow, and I guess it happens. But I don't know if it's, I mean, my question is not, is it good? But my question, is it better than the alternative? And I think it is a way for us to at least move a little bit forwards, even though it might not be perfect. But I don't have the numbers on this, and I'm no expert in this. And so, like, I think this is, again, something we should study. And I mean, I ask the funding agencies again here to give us money, obviously.
Cool, excellent. We have one more question from YouTube as well. And I think so the question is about marginalized groups and kind of unfair treatment when metrics are applied. And do you as a panel worry about kind of when metrics go away, that it will kind of make an unfair effect on marginalized groups when metrics are taken away and you have to look at more qualitative stuff, and maybe some of these marginalized groups don't have access to do the things that are required in this broader sense of evaluation. What do we think about that? Stephen.
Well, I think one has to also bear in mind the marginalization that operates through metrics, okay? I mean, it's clearly possible through qualitative processes for biases to creep in, but we know, for example, that women are more likely to take career breaks to raise families than men. And so if you're looking at raw citation counts and paper numbers, then if you're not taking account of that, then you are introducing bias. People tend to downweight publications and papers that come from low and middle income countries. And so again, there's a bias there if one is looking at the sort of metrics in that. And so for any assessment, then it's clearly important that the people doing the assessment are trained to be aware of these factors and that the processes do take account of it. And so I'm involved, for example, in an ERC panel, and the candidates are able then to talk about whether they've had career breaks, and that that is taken on board by the reviewers and by the panel. And so that is one way of dealing with that. Clearly, it introduces extra layers of complexity, but as we've been discussing today, these kinds of judgments of different research proposals of different people doing researchers, they're extremely difficult, complex ideas. It doesn't surprise me in the least that agreement between panels is only around 40% on the very best. Actually, that strikes me as quite a rather impressive outcome. I just think we need to be really aware of of the complexities of it. And certainly if we are looking to make changes, I think there is a rather simplistic assumption sometimes that, you know, the numbers are objective and people are subjective. And I don't think that bears out reality. I think I have worked on panels that can actually deal very intelligently with assessing or taking account of people's backgrounds. Of course, I can't put numbers on that, but that, I think, again, that's probably the best we can do right now.
I'm gonna target Naomi. Did any of this kind of discussion come up in your research or in the data that you've collected?
Not directly, no. But I think it's a really interesting topic because, well, so the one thing that I noticed was a lot of the women that participated in my research, for example, mentioned that men were much better at selling themselves. And then they worried that if we turn towards a narrative CV, they might be left behind. And this is something that I thought was, well, yesterday during the discussion, I think it was Francesca who spoke about the ESO diversity policies, and she said that they look at the language differences, at more common languages and different ways that different groups react in non-metric non-metric situations. And I think that's it's already good to know these issues. But I just want to raise a point that Uta raised in the chat, that actually looking at metrics is there's a big danger that we forget this that this bias exists because we have an illusion of objectivity. So I really think it's the opposite way. It's that when you have a more holistic view of a researcher's profile, of a researcher's project or anything that you want to assess, if you have something more holistic, you're less likely to focus on one point and say, well, now I have my number, I have my answer, and there's no bias to that.
Uta, do you want to develop that idea further?
Well, that's exactly actually what I meant. Thank you for your nice feedback, Noemi. I mean, the numbers, once we put metrics to something, we seemingly are objective, and that is clearly not the case. And then it takes a double effort, so to say, to overcome this non-moving behavior where we do not consider that there is bias. It's the intrinsic bias, the unconscious bias of which we all suffer, and that we have to consciously remember time and time again. And numbers might be even hiding this trick our minds play on us.
Excellent. We have 10 more minutes, and I saw 2 more questions. So Martin, do you want to jump in here, and then we'll move to the next question?
All right, just agree with all the other speakers on that specific topic. Just to add, there's also much of wrong ideas about objectivity, and also the call for objectivity comes from people who say, well, you know, we have to address address favoritism, and the way out of favoritism is objectivity. Actually, the way out of favoritism is transparency, it's not objectivity.
Excellent point. We had a hand raised by Federico Lelli, then you lowered it. Would you like to, please?
Yes, I would like to discuss a more general point that Noemi made during her presentation, which is the fact that the perception of career success doesn't go along with research success, which I found very frightening, because what we really want in the end is to be good researchers and do good research, for the generation to come. But all or most of the metrics and evaluation system and so on tend to favor the career success. So it seems to me that to break to solve this discrepancy, we really need also sort of different educational and, if you want, philosophical attitude towards being a scientist and doing science. I don't have a solution, of course, but I'm thinking in terms of, you know, also being able to say, I have a minor result, I may not write it, I only publish what is really good and polished and, you know, reproducible paper. I don't know if that's one way to go, so I would like to know what you think about it, but what could be a way to really break that distinction that that is terrifying.
Should I respond directly? Sure. Okay, so that's an excellent question, and actually, I mean, it's so my starting point to do my PhD project was research integrity, and I was looking at whether the way we assess researchers breaks the integrity in science. So it was really a direct correlation. What I found that actually the current research assessments are damaging for the integrity and the quality of our research. And I like your point about the need to sort of reinforce the norms of what it is to be a scientist, the principles of you are a scientist, so you're there to do something good, to advance society. And I had a few people in my interviewees discussing this point and saying that we need more courses on history of science to teach people about, well, why they are doing this work, how it came about, what are their theories, why it's normal to have negative results also, and all of these things, also about philosophy of science. And I completely agree with that. I think that should be in all different disciplines. There should be more focus on what it means to be a scientist. It could just be a course where you also learn what the impact factor is, how it's calculated, and these things that we don't even learn throughout our PhDs, even though we publish and we use scientific journals. So I really think we need to focus on that. But then there's another point that I think is the breaking point, and I don't know how to solve it, is the huge competition and the fact that at some point in your career, at least 9 out of 10, they will have to choose whether surviving in that system or acting with strong integrity, being the best scientist. If assessments don't change at some point, they will have to choose, well, I'm doing this, but it's just because otherwise I will never have a grant, or otherwise I'll be, I won't have tenured, I'll be fired. So I think we still have a bigger problem, and this is why I showed the structural issues where the system is broken, repairable, I would say repairable, but we have to change how this hyper competition is managed inside science, I think.
Excellent, thank you. Martin and Wolfgang.
So in line with what Noemi said, I think we're facing another major cultural challenge here. And in particular, I think we've unlearned how to critically and respectfully debate science. A lot of science careers are just built on showing off, demonstrating that one is better than anyone else. If we want to advance science, we have to come together and debate it, because this is how it will evolve. And I think we have to relearn that. And that completely relates to peer review and the wider debate culture in science.
Excellent. Wolfgang, you want to take us home?
I want to use a different, or I want to go at this from a different angle, and I would love to hear also from Noemi about this. I think one of the issues that we sort of having science and its assessment metrics is that the permanent positions in science are managers, and I think not necessarily researchers. And one of the things that I always like to do is to look at outside of academia, because these are groups of people I'm going to pick out Google and Apple and some of the bigger knowledge worker companies, which are very similar to what we do at universities, but they don't work as universities do out of multiple reasons. But one of the things is they hire a team of people solve a problem. Like, I mean, the phone here that is, I mean, which is now transparent, but the phone here, which I'm holding in my hand, is made by a team of people, and it's known. The brand is known. It is not known the individual. Like, it doesn't say like, no, I don't know, David et al. Or whatever. So it doesn't have a specific. It has a brand name attached to this, and I think this might be one of the issues that we are doing science as it was done in the 1600s, where we sort of have different departments doing different things, rather than doing science like modern knowledge worker companies do, where they hire teams to solve a problem. And once this problem is solved, like, these teams disperse, and then they work on other teams on new problems. And so I'm wondering if, like, if this is one way to make science fairer, to just change the way that we work and much more have, like, teams as first authors rather than anything else.
Really good point to to bring up towards the end. Before we close, let's end on a positive point. I want to give everybody the chance to give a last word. We'll go in reverse order of the talks, and if you could just give a piece of advice or motivation, how do we move forward in this current research assessment system together? What are the kind of main values or ideas, or what would you suggest for a change in our research culture, assessment culture? So, Stephen.
Thank you. It's been a really interesting afternoon of discussion, but I would focus on the positive. I know there are many challenges and there are some noisy debates in this whole area, but we do have an awful lot in common as a scientific and scholarly community. And I think it's about people, what they say about art. I don't know much about art, but I know what I like, and the same thing I think is true of good research and good quality science. I think we all know it when we see it, and it's something that we all value. And the question we really have before us is, well, how broad are the activities that we value? But events like this, and events, and the session in the Netherlands that Naomi talked about before. There's a vigorous debate going on in the Netherlands about the whole approach to research assessment, and that's entirely healthy. And there are people on different sides, but if we're talking about it, then we are actually shifting the norms of behavior, and that's that. And to my mind, that's going in a positive direction. I know progress seems slow, but if you step back and look from the perspective of history, people will look back and say there was a big shift that happened around the turn of the sort of 21st century. So be positive.
Thank you. Martin.
Yeah, I would like to reiterate the point that the change that you want to see is in your hands. It might not happen tomorrow, but it might happen the day after tomorrow.
Thank you. Wolfgang.
I also want to end on a positive note and say, I think there are many changes, and there are things that are changed for the better. My main word of advice and caution is there are many lofty goals, but there's also pragmatic decisions that we have to do on a day-to-day basis. And so when these suggestions coming up, I think we also need to think about when I hire postdocs, I need to pick one because NSF gives me money for one postdoc, and then I need to have some criteria. And so I think there are rules that are currently binding us, and we can work on these rules, but I think it's also important to think about the here now and concrete proposals to make our trade better.
Thank you. Jenny.
Yeah, I think one overarching theme is transparency in assessment, whether it's of people, the researchers, or individual or research itself. I mean, and Laura talked about this, who joined the discussion, as well as all of the panelists, of be clear on what it is your criteria are. Another piece of transparency that I think all of us have touched on is just the openness of science. Like when you open the science itself, everyone can win. I'm not saying there are a lot of problems with this shift, but I mean, the public sees what we're doing. It's accessible to researchers who both have, a large number of means through wherever they happen to be working, and lesser means when it's accessible just out on the web, whether it's data, software, the publications themselves. So, I think that the open shift is going to be part of the solution. I don't think it necessarily is the solution.
Thank you. Uta.
Well, I'm a big fan of collaboration. So when it comes to evaluation, I would wish for a much stronger and more active demand to show how collaborative people are and value that more strongly. Also, when it comes to evaluation, the managers and always deciding, about the positions was mentioned before. So there, the term rotation comes to mind. Maybe that would be a good idea, to not have the same people always in the same positions. And finally, what Francesca said yesterday, diversity in any kinds of committees, I think is really important, to bring in as many views as possible.
Thank you. Noemi, you get the last word.
This is stressful. Yeah, I would say, well, two things. So on the one hand, I completely agree with Stephen. There is huge progress. When I started my PhD, so 5 years ago, I'm not even sure. When I started my PhD, I could see 1 or 2 articles about research assessments every month, maybe. And now I cannot even keep up with them. There is so much happening. I have overlapping conferences on research assessments. And I think everyone I speak to now knows these issues really without even thinking. Like there's so much more awareness. So this is very positive. And on the other hand, I would say, so I keep saying there's problems in the structures, there's problems in the system that are very difficult to address. And of course, we need the help from the big players. But as I said, I also think that as researchers, we are part of this culture. And as a small exercise for myself, after doing my PhD, I sort of did my interview guide on myself. So tried to understand what is my view of success in science. And it's quite interesting when you ask yourself, who are the successful researchers that you know, and try to find these characteristics. And do you agree about yourself liking these characteristics of other people? So I think we also can shape what we see in science and in success.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to close the session. A massive thank you to the speakers for your wonderful insight and discussions. A big thanks to all the participants and the great questions that were asked and discussed. And of course, to the organizers, Giacomo, Henri, and everybody else behind the scenes that were involved, named or not named, in the essence of fair evaluation and valuing of what was done. And with that, see you tomorrow for the next session, and have a